Mwencha, are you there?
Yes, very much so, Shaka.
Well, you heard, of course, the gentleman from Ghana. He raised the issue about this African mantra of African solutions to African problems. And he sort of actually challenged you and said, in a rather very unpleasant, perhaps, description or language, that the African Union, at least in his view, is a toothless bulldog. Is that a fair statement?
Well, let me begin, Shaka, with the comments made by my fellow panelist when he talked about Gaddafi's financial muscle and how he has financed the African Union. Mm-hmm. First of all, to dispute the figures he has, I don't know where he got those figures, but I can tell you right now, and as I speak, and I'm speaking with a lot of authority here, that Libya has not even paid its dues for 2 years, and that was largely because Gaddafi disputed some of the position that has been taken by the African Union vis-a-vis the project that you mentioned.
That's true.
And that is the African Union government. And that brings me to the second point, that he calls the African Union a Gaddafi project. That would be slighting the African leaders to imply that they have just simply come along. And I can tell you that in the last 3 years that I've been at the Commission, I have seen African leaders stand up to him and reject quite a number of his proposals, which means whatever has been done by Africa is what Africa has considered a legitimate position that we can move on. And I'm happy that Ambassador Cohen himself was able to recognize and say something positive. But yes, he had his own downside, but he had done some also good things. And I think during this kind of discussions, let's not be emotional, start seeing everything as wrong. We all recognize that, yes, the country Libya had its huge problems. I mean, not having a constitution, not having a parliament, and Africa is not a country. And that's the point I would like to register here. When one talks about Africa, as if Africa is a country. Mind you, Africa is 54 countries. And in Africa, you have this continuum. You have seen changes that are affecting the continent. You have seen that we now have regular elections and very good elections. We have also had difficult elections. And so Africa is changing. And so you shouldn't just simply talk Africa as if Africa is a static country which doesn't exist as a country that has been stuck in history somewhere. But the fundamental point that we should make, Shaka, here is when it comes to changing any regime, it is best done when it is the people who choose to remove and decide on what governance they want. If indeed we are going to say the outside world can decide which kind of government is good, which kind of democracy is good for any country, then of course, why do we have all these double standards? Look around the world. Is it only in Africa where we have bad regimes? Why do you leave some of them and only go for the African ones? I think Africa is changing, and Africa is changing some of the so-called, as you say, bad leaders. And so Africa should be left to do that like the rest of the world is doing.
I think your point is well made, but before I go to Professor Ayittey, what about the other question from Lloyd in Ghana, where he pretty much really, very unpleasantly says that in his view, at least, the African Union is a toothless bulldog. Would you say that is a fair statement? Mr. Mwencha?
I'm trying to answer that question.
Yes, please.
If you look at international relations now, the African Union is very much in the center of international public shaping of whatever is happening. If you look at what is happening under climate change, or you look at even in the UN Security Council, yes, Africa's position may be ignored, but it doesn't mean that Africa has not taken a position. And that position being doesn't mean it's toothless. Of course, even after the First World War or the Second World War, the victors set the rules. against the vanquished. But that doesn't mean that they remained weak. But the answer here is Africa has continuously stood and championed the cause for, first of all, democracy of the continent, decolonization of the continent, and Africa has had a moral high ground to the extent that we can now see decolonization has taken place, we can see apartheid is gone, and Africa is pushing forward. And Africa is now starting to, you can see Africa is growing because Africa, growth is coming about because of fundamental changes that are taking place in the continent. Governance is improving, democracy is improving, and Africa is the place for the future.
What about someone who will come back to you and say, wait a minute, Mr. Mwencha, yes, the African Union took a specific position when it came to Madagascar, that you took a position when it came to Niger, that you took a position when it came to Guinea-Conakry, and that perhaps you even took a position, as a matter of fact, you know, in Kenya in 2008, and someone might probably even give you some credit for Zimbabwe. But that you did not really do much when it came to the Ivory Coast, that you stood by when it came to the uprisings in Tunisia, in Egypt, and lately in Libya.
Well, I'm not sure you can say that in the case of Ivory Coast, Africa stood by. Africa, in fact, even the African monitors who were on the ground did declare that the results were not, what was declared was not free and fair, and Africa had many initiatives to try and resolve the crisis. Of course, Africa has not at any stage advocated military intervention, because Africa's philosophy right from the beginning, even decolonization, was on the basis that that can be done without having to shed blood. So Africa's position for that position has remained very consistent. And I think what you mentioned in the case of Madagascar, Africa suspended Madagascar from the membership, and Madagascar still remains suspended, and many others that you mentioned. So Africa has remained vigilant, and of course there's a doctrine that guides Africa, and that doctrine is one that if there is a coup, that coup cannot be blessed by Africa. Of course, even the challenge then comes here. If the government that is being toppled is not legitimate, what do you do? Now that can be very complicated. In the case of what you mentioned, what has happened, the so-called Arab Spring, this was a phenomenon that was quite new to anybody in the continent and all over the world. But Africa moved quickly. I mean, we've been to Egypt, we've been to Tunisia, and we saw that the people themselves were conducting, the people themselves were in charge of their destiny, the people themselves were clear of what they want. So you don't need anybody to come and supervise the people who are very clear what they want to do. And that is exactly the philosophy we say, that any change should be guided by the people, and the people should own the process of change.
I see. Well, let's go to the lifeline of the show, which are the telephone callers again. We go to Samuel from Uganda. Good evening, Samuel. You're most welcome to Straight Talk Africa.
Good evening, Shaka. How are you?
Usually terrific, Samuel.
Let me ask my brother, Dr. George Ayittey. Dr. George, we have seen African Union keeping quiet in the crisis in Africa. We have given examples of Madagascar, examples of, of course, now this is Libya. Now, what happens if the rebel forces bombard Sirte, which is the last stronghold of Gaddafi? And what happens if they get Gaddafi in Sirte and capture him? What happens? What is the role of the African Union if that gentleman is captured? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And still in East Africa, good evening, Joseph from Kenya. You're most welcome to Straight Talk Africa.
Thank you so much.
You're most welcome, sir.
I wanted to say this, that as much as we are fighting Africa and we are saying that we have not been able to achieve much, I think we have done quite a lot, and I think we need to pat our back and say that Africa is waking up from the slumber of a long time. We have seen Africa going across, restoring peace in several countries in Africa. we have seen it interfering in Sierra Leone, Ivory Coast. We had our Prime Minister being sent there to quell violence. And I think they did well. They succeeded.
I see. You have a question?
So I think what we need to do is to say that AU did not do well for the fact that it did not interfere with the violence in Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya. I think it was the right time. It was to allow for revolution to take place, so that at least we have now democracy going across Africa. So my question is it not the right time again now to strengthen AU so that at least it becomes the custodian of democratic principles in Africa?
Thank you. Thank you very much. What about that, Professor Ayittey? Is that possible, especially given an institution, an organization that is made up of 54 countries, and yet, I insist, you may find it very difficult, frankly, to get more than 15 countries that fit the characterization of democracy?
Well, look, let the AU define what democracy means, and let the AU push it, okay? Because right now it doesn't understand what democracy is. Look, prevention is better than cure. If these countries, Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, had been democratic, there wouldn't have been all this bloodshed. And we shouldn't just focus on Libya and Tunisia and Egypt. We should look at the rest of the African countries which are not democratic. Look at Cameroon, okay? Look at Equatorial Guinea. Look at Chad. Look at Uganda. Look at Zimbabwe. What is the AU doing about this? Is the AU waiting for these countries to implode?
But what about the point by Mr. Mwencha that most African countries have been holding periodic elections? What about some who say these years are elections, but surely are they elections or selections?
There is no election in Africa which the AU doesn't like and certify free and fair. You know, there have been bogus elections, sham elections occurring in Africa, and the AU doesn't stand up, to condemn them until we create, our own African solutions. You see, the thing with the AU is that, look.
In fairness to the African Union, they did not endorse the last election in Ivory Coast.
All right, good. We need to see more of that, okay? Because time and time again, when a crisis erupts in Africa, the AU does nothing. It doesn't come up with any African solution. The moment the international community gets involved, then, then it's, chaos and, everything goes ballistic. Yes, the NATO people are in Libya just for the oil. And then we're trying to see all kinds of, ulterior motivations why the international... Look, don't call upon the international community unless you have your own African solution.